And so let me go over adoption, just like I explained first century Roman slavery on the last podcast. Let me give an overview of the adoption that Paul is really, that Paul really has in mind when he's writing this language and this analogy about us being adopted and us attaining an inheritance as sons now through adoption. Adoption in ancient Rome was a lot different than it is today. Today we have, babies that, are born, the parents die, the parents go berserk, or they leave the children, they abandon the children, or, you might have a mother who doesn't want to care for a child, but she's pregnant, but she doesn't want to she doesn't want to abort the baby, so she chooses to carry the baby, then have the baby adopted because she's in no position to raise a child. And first century Roman slavery was quite different. First century Roman adoption was totally different than that. First century Roman adoption was mostly for grown men, somewhere around the age of 20 to 30, maybe as old as 30. Young men who had become adults, who were in their prime, really, who were adopted by noble families from kind of the common class of families, the commoners of the society. The nobles would seek after these common men if they had good attributes, if they had something about them that caught the attention of the noble family. And let's say the noble family didn't have an heir. There was no man to carry on the family wealth, carry on the family name. They needed to adopt a son. But they didn't want to adopt, a tiny child and raise them. They really didn't have any interest in that part of the process. Because in that day, you didn't even know if that child would live. So if you wanted to adopt someone, you wanted to adopt someone that was healthy, who had good characteristics, who you knew would be sort of likely to last and to carry on the family's wealth and name. So the motivation was completely different for adoption in Roman time, in the time that Paul's writing. So contemporary adoption is aimed at placing a child in a loving family. Roman adoption was aimed at providing a suitable male heir when the family patriarch died. And if a man had no sons, like I said, adoption was a common solution among the noble classes and the senators and the equestrians, some of the upper class people. So women were seldom adopted. I mean, this is why the word sons is used so predominantly here. It's an analogy, and women, regardless of class, really weren't adopted because they couldn't carry that family lineage or name. So families with surplus of sons who were in the lower classes or the common class of people were often willing to have one or more of their sons adopted to make desirable family connections to and improve their son's opportunities. Because if your son got adopted into the upper class, you would have a connection to the upper class then, and you knew your son would live a good life. The adopted son was usually an older son who had survived childhood, like I said, and displayed some desirable traits as an adult, whether they be intellect or strength or whatever. The adopted son would really become a member of the family, just as if it had been born of blood from the adopter. It was a complete, you are now in this family, and you have full claim to everything within the family. You know everyone, and it's like you were born here. That's what adoption was like. And he was invested in, becoming a part of that family. As a matter of fact, it was by this means that the succession amongst the Caesars, the emperors of Rome, was continued. It was never descended from father to son because you had poison, divorce, and all sorts of things. The surviving members of family were few a lot of the times, and the descendants suffered from constant interruption, and whole families disappeared. And so in no case among the Caesars, or rare cases, did the throne pass from a father to a son. So for example, Augustus was the great-nephew of Julius Caesar. and was adopted from the Octavian into Julius into that line and into that succession. Tiberius was of no relation at all to his predecessor. He was merely a son of Augustus's wife Livia by Tiberius Claudius Nero. So here we have, the introduction of family members being kind of grafted in, as biblical language will say. And Nero was the great nephew of his predecessor Claudius, who had adopted him in the year 80-50. We have record of all these adoptions in the royal lineage. And just to give a little bit more background, now that was on the highest level, but this occurred throughout the noble class, amongst the senators, amongst the nobles. But to give a little bit more background, a little bit more detail, often a large sum was paid by the noble family to adopt the young man to become their heir. Because, if you're a commoner, let's say you had a great, there's a whole selection of great candidates, great young men with good qualities, and so they're kind of bid on almost. And the nobles would repay the family. I mean, they didn't just want to take the son for a small price. The family would demand a high price to give their son away. And there would often be a ceremony where the man could officially change status from one family to the next. Now he's completely removed from that family and into the next one. Total change of identity. So often there was a ceremony and, where he would change his name, his status, leave behind his old family, and become part of this new family. There would often be witnesses also at the ceremony to ensure the legitimacy of this man's adoption, so that stray family members wouldn't come out of the woodwork and try to invalidate that guy's place when the inheritance was being divvied up. Also, there were laws in place prohibiting a noble family who had adopted a son from disowning or removing him from the family. Once the son was brought in, once the young man was adopted officially, he was guaranteed the inheritance. It was a guarantee by law that he was in that family, and nothing could change that. It was so ingrained in their culture and in their legal system.